Seems like no one's around. Looks like the coast is clear. This'll be a perfect spot. Oh, hey everyone. Give me 1 second, just need to do something real quick. Don't ask why I have this. Or how I got it. Oh hey, it's actually working. Hello everyone, and welcome to Review Shark. The other name was taken. Today we're going to be taking a look at Battlefield Middle-earth 2, an RTS based around the Lord of the Rings franchise. Why are we reviewing the sequel first and not the original? Yeah, because the original's pretty forgettable, in all honesty. It screams licensed movie game all over it. It's decently competent, but has quite a few balance issues, nailed between the good and evil factions. It's also got a handful of decent levels themed after the movies in the campaign, but in between those missions is just a bunch of repetitive filler. It's so standard that clips of the movie will just play from time to time at the corner. Battlefield Middle-earth 2, on the other hand, this game takes from both the movies and the books, and with the experience of the last game under its belt, manages a much more complete experience all around, in gameplay, presentation, and story. The gameplay is much more predictable for an RTS this time around. Free building rather than the forced and limited building placements of the first. Walls and defenses are much less static as well, although walls can be placed in a certain radius around your fortress. We'll get to that. Resources are still condensed into one general pool, but rather than each building have a fixed production rate, you have to strategically place them around in order to get the most out of them. Each building has a radius around it, and the more open space there is, the more resources you get out of it. This also includes your own buildings, by the way, to a minor degree. Instead of needing to train units to upgrade buildings, you just upgrade them standalone this time, so that way you don't have situations from the first game where you have to build up an army of cheap units in order to get the ones that actually counter other units. Speaking of counter, the general combat of the game is pretty much unchanged from the first. Army sizes have increased massively to add to the spectacle, but it still revolves around a pretty basic rock, paper, scissors system. Pikemen counter cavalry, swordsmen counter pikemen, archers counter infantry, cavalry counter everything that isn't pikemen. It's simplistic, but lends itself pretty decently to your typical micromanagement, as you're going to want to keep all your units focused on countering what they can actually counter in combat, otherwise they're basically just going to be coughing politely in the direction of the enemy. Sense cavalry, that is, who just curb stomp everything in their path. They have a trample mechanic that allows them to plow over enemy troops in their way, only taking minor health damage in return, which is an actual weakness now compared to the first game where the game says you take damage but lies to you. There's 6 races to choose from compared to the 4 from the first, though it's more like there's 3 new factions since the 2 human factions were merged into one. You have in order: Elves, expensive and supposedly strong; Dwarves, a Turtler's wet dream; Men, Generico brand human faction; Mordor, the Legions of the Haradrim with some orcs and trolls thrown in; Isengard, literally unchanged from the first game; and Goblins, objectively the worst faction in the game. Factions in general are much more balanced from the first game, mostly. Evil factions actually feel viable this time around, and their abilities and units don't feel quite so underpowered. Each faction for the most part feel unique in ways, but there are some parallels between them. Goblins and Dwarves can move their infantry between their resource buildings, allowing for some decent stealth tactics or ambushes. Isengard and Elves have some of the strongest infantry, but also the most expensive, and Gondor and Mordor exist. Most of the factions play pretty straightforwardly, and truthfully, a lot of the units function pretty similarly. It just becomes a game of learning what counters what and how to best utilize your units. It's pretty fun. It really brings the spectacle of the movies to life, and encourages proper formation planning, otherwise your opponent can pretty easily exploit holes in your defenses. Defenses are another thing to mention. Since the change from the first game of fixed outposts to free building, you can place walls and towers pretty much wherever you want, with one important factor. Walls can only be placed in a radius around your fortress. This encourages consolidating most of your base building as much as possible, unless you want to spend a needless amount of resources building more fortresses in order to expand your defenses outward. But since resource buildings lose effectiveness based on what's around them, including buildings, you'll end up wanting to move your resources anywhere where you can place them. It places a nice importance on rating units due to how spread out your economy you get, forcing you to think strategically about your defenses. Or just put guard towers everywhere. That also works. One of the other big draws of the game are the powers, a system of special abilities you can call down at will to change the course of a battle dramatically. These can range from simple things like healing your units, spawning an area that buffs your units, to summoning the Balrog, or summoning the Army of the Dead. Each faction have their own set of basic powers, although every race has powers that are exclusively theirs, like humans with the Army of the Dead, elves summoning a horse flood, or goblins with the dragon that's observable as white tissue. In general, good powers are more direct, like healing or buffing, while evil powers are more subversive, like generating extra resources or debuffing. There's also one major aspect of the gameplay we can't forget: the heroes. There's a pretty wide variety of heroes for most of the races, and they'll usually be the backbone of your army. At least in the early game they will. The main issue with them being that they need to level up to get access to their powers and special abilities. Early on this isn't much of an issue as you can properly protect and back them up with your armies. But as you get on later in the game and your opponents unlock more ways to deal with your forces, you'll find that buying the later, more expensive heroes may not be worth the risk. Gandalf, for example, is the most expensive unit for the human race, and also the strongest. However, the problem from earlier comes up. He starts at level 1 and costs 5,000 resources, which leaves you with two options. Rush and save your resources to buy him and making do with a much smaller military and economy, or buy him in the late game where it'll be easy for him to be picked off by the enemy. If you manage to get him to level 10 though, he can do things like this. But at level 1, he only has access to a basic cone attack and has about as much health as a hobbit. It's a balance that I don't think works too well in practice. Cheaper heroes are decent for the early game, but later game heroes end up being too much of a cost sink in both resources and time. Not to mention you have to spend a good chunk of their base cost in order to revive them if they die. There's two other features I think are pretty notable in terms of gameplay. Create a Heroes and Ring Heroes. For Create a Heroes, there's an option in the menu to create your own hero for a faction. It's... okay. The options are kind of limited in terms of appearance. You can make humans, elves, dwarves, wizards, orcs, Uruk-hai, Haradrim, and trolls. You choose your race, give them an appearance and name, choose their stats, give them powers, etc. There's definitely some overpowered combinations of powers you can choose too. Powers work by choosing them on levels, starting off weak and building towards the final power that you really want. Some of the powers start off pretty weak, but then at higher levels get kind of absurd. Hey, how about an ability that lets you turn half your opponent's army against them? Ooh, I got one better! Let's give them an ability that lets them turn invincible for an hour. Ooh, I got one! One that lets you turn their entire army into livestock! Now granted, you still have to level your heroes to max for some of those overpowered abilities, but some of them are still pretty strong even at lower levels. Needless to say, creative heroes aren't usually used in multiplayer for a reason. The other feature in multiplayer is Ring Heroes. Wandering throughout any map is Gollum, who's invisible until you get close to him. You find him, kill him, and get the Ring of Power. You take it to your base, and you get one of two heroes depending on whether you're good or evil. If you're evil, you obviously get Sauron. He's incredibly slow, but his default hits send chunks of armies flying. It can also summon a giant meteor storm. If you're good, you get... Galadriel.
In place of a Dark Lord, you would have a queen! Not dark, but beautiful and terrible as the dawn!
Yeah, that dark and terrible queen was a perfect idea for the good side. Sure. She's faster but weaker than Sauron, and has the ability to summon a whirlwind. She's fine. These are definitely just spectacle characters, as Sigemi had to find the ring and then save 10,000 resources. They'd only really come up during the late game, and by then the game would either be over, or your resources would be much better spent on high-tier units. They're also usually disabled for a reason. But speaking of spectacle, this game has a pretty great presentation. It's not just the fact that you have giant armies smacking into one another, it's that everything is backed up by pretty great sound design and animation. Mostly.
Our forces are under attack!
Like any RTS, it's obviously much more geared towards giant horde battles, but when you take two heroes for example, and have them fight, the sounds get much weaker. The graphics are certainly alright for 2006, but it's the little things that really help sell the presentation. Units and buildings have unique idle animations, select animations, and the lighting and particle effects still look fantastic. Just take a look at the main menu. So pretty. Not exactly the best mood setter for war so much as a lovely walk in the park, but this genuinely still looks pretty fantastic, and says a lot about how you can sell subpar graphics with the right lighting and effects. There's also the soundtrack to the game, which is just the music from the movies, and it still sounds great. But now we get to the real main course of the game, to me anyway, the single-player campaign. While the original game followed the films, this one follows a battle that only got one mention in the movies, the Battle of the North, the one that had the dwarves and elves busy. Much like the first game, there's a good campaign and evil campaign, and they're both far improved over the first game's campaigns. The first game had a few focused missions, but mostly just threw you into generic skirmish matches.
Destroy all Isengard forces! Destroy all Isengard forces!
Destroy all Rohan forces!
Destroy all Isengard forces!
The campaigns of the second are definitely shorter, but far more focused, and much more memorable for that matter. The good campaign follows pretty much the canon story. You join both Glorfindel and Glóin in their quest to stop the forces of Mordor from conquering the North. While on the evil campaign, you lead both the Goblin King and the Mouth of Sauron in their assaults on the North. The story itself is fairly forgettable in all honesty. The characters on the good side don't really have that much to them overall, and end up being kind of forgettable. The evil characters are much more fun in general since they're just chewing the scenery to pieces, but personality-wise, they're pretty one-dimensional. The writing never goes much past the missions themselves, beyond some brief snippets of world buildings with the cutscenes that bridge the levels together. Character interactions in the missions tend to be brief at best, so there's never much development. But the question is this a bad thing? Kinda. Some of the missions can get a little repetitive, yes, and the lack of good character interaction, mostly in the hero campaign, makes things pretty dull, but the objectives and set pieces help make up for that. From having to gather together scattered forces to repel an attack on Dale, to stopping a naval assault from the Corsairs of Umbar while goblins are attacking from another front. Oh, by the way, this game has naval combat, but it's so underdeveloped it's really not worth talking about. To defending Erebor from all the armies of Mordor led by the Mouth of Sauron, or to my personal favorite mission of the game, leading an assault on the Shire. As much as I prefer a well-fleshed-out story above all else, the story of Battle for Middle-earth 2 is geared more towards entertainment than depth, and I think it pulls it off in a great enough manner to where any shortcomings just become nitpicks at best. Or at least, don't make me want to blow my brains out. I wish the characters on the good side had slightly more personality to them, or at least went a little bit more over the top, but what we got is still serviceable. Although one of the major factions are elves, so expecting personality might be a bit much. The evil campaign doesn't have all that much depth either, granted, but boy is it fun to be evil. They promised what the original game did, just stupid amounts of evil fun. Like the sacking of the Shire is a perfect example. As much as I hate the goblins gameplay-wise, they're a lot of fun story-wise. The Goblin King especially just devours the scenery in every mission he's in.
Destroy the elves! Burn it all down! At last, the Shire is mine! Sire, it's the orcs from Isengard! What? What are they doing here?
There's just one slight thing to the evil campaign. You're playing a lot of missions for the good campaign, but from the opposite perspective. I love it personally, and I think it's a great show of both good level design and using their assets to their full potential. Heck, at the end you assault Rivendell with both the goblins and the armies of Mordor combined. And near the end, Sauron shows up just for you to play with, followed by a glorious charge from the Fellowship in their last desperate bid to defeat you. It feels just as grandiose as it sounds. Even... Oh man, Sauron versus Aragorn. Time to show them the power of the...
A battle lost is not the war.
Oh, and also the game has a mode called War of the Ring, which is a nice little addition. You play a campaign versus another player or AI where you conquer Middle-earth, make heroes, build resources, and move them on a macro scale, etc, etc. I'm not a big fan of it. It's not flawed, it's just slow and boring. And this is coming from a guy who likes slow and boring. The game got one expansion called The Rise of the Witch King, which adds the faction of Angmar. This expansion takes exclusively from the books, and it's a lot of fun. There's more mission variety compared to the base game, but there's just one campaign. And an epilogue. The campaign involves the Witch King settling in Angmar and waging war against the Kingdom of Arnor, and boy do we see why the Witch King is named to be feared in this universe. He rips apart the kingdom and utterly ruins it through strategy, brute force, and cruelty. And when he experiences a major defeat that would set his campaign back quite a bit, just carve the barrow downs into the vicious hellscape we all know and love. Angmar is a pretty fun addition to the game, but they do follow the usual the expansion faction tends to be a bit imbalanced formula. Their base infantry can be customized on a whim to counter whatever needs to be countered, and their stronger infantry counters most things in general. You have obscenely powerful troll infantry as well, and have an army of sorcerers that can turn the tide of battle in a second either by nuking your army, freezing your army, or turning them into whites. The other factions get some new toys to play with as well in the form of elite units. Units stronger than most base units, but not quite as strong as heroes. You can only have a limited amount of them at once, but they do make up for it in strength. The expansion, however, doesn't have a beautiful animated title screen, which makes me sad. Well, taking all this into account, let's consult the Dark Magic of the Palantir in order to see what the best numerical rating for this game will be.
Your time is over.
Yeah, that sounds about right. The game does a great job with its source material and gives you pretty much everything you'd want from a Lord of the Rings RTS. It really improved itself compared to the first game, and overall it's just a heck of a lot of fun. The story is still the only real sticking point for me, since I remember the levels themselves, but not so much the story bits that happened within and in between. I would say pick up a copy for yourself, but unfortunately this game was made back when EA held the license to the Lord of the Rings games, which it has since lost. The game's not on any storefront and is basically lost in limbo. I'd definitely say it's abandonware at this point, since it doesn't seem like the game's going to be re-released anytime in the future. The only real way to play it is to find a second-hand copy, as there's no way to 100% legally acquire a copy of the game at this point. Nope. I've included a link in the description to a site that has patches to the game as well, as it's where I got the updates to my old busted copy. Well, this was fun. I'm planning on doing more of these in the future, so if you like this video, let me know. Do the usual subscribe, like, comment, etc. stuff. Tune in next time when I show you how I'm the greatest hospital designer of all time. Thank you, and also...
Hey! It's the enemy! They're here!
Oh crap. Thanks for watching, bye!
Now you will die.
Cavalry counter everything that isn't pikemen.